Thank you very much for giving me the floor and to give this presentation. And I'm happy really to tell my story about this. I don't know whether I will end at the 15 degrees, but we can see during the talk. It is a bit more subtle than just one fixed temperature. I'm a biologist, but for quite a few years already engaged in the built environment as well, putting my knowledge and experiments into practice. And but I would like to start just a few slides on the global warming. This is a Dutch slide, sorry for that, but you see there's really huge increase in heat waves in Europe, and you see also the beach visits. I hope the slides are visible now. Can you say yes? Yeah. Okay. And then this is then in last year, still a lot of people again on the beach. Again, heat waves, but in this time they had to keep distance because of the COVID. But another thing that is not so clear with this and surprising with a global warming is that, of course, you would expect an increase in heat waves, and that you see with the red line on the top graph. But as a matter of fact, and that this study in Nature clearly shows, that there's also in cold extreme incidences in the world. So both heat waves and cold extremes occur with the global warming, and that has to do with air currents and ocean currents, water currents. So the details is not so important, but we still have to deal with cold as well. And as we had this year also quite cold winter, but especially in Canada and some parts of Siberia, it's very cold. So, but the point is we are nowadays not really exposed anymore to the outdoor environment. Many people stay more than 90% of their time indoors. So we are in fact indoor people. But in case of power plant disturbances and other incidences, we are maybe sometimes exposed to these extremes again. And then we are not trained to that. And I hope to tell you something about that we can make use of the indoor climate and do something with our body and make use of our biological characteristics instead of always having the same temperature. I come to that, of course, during this talk. There's a lot of attention to sustainability, and then especially with respect to the built environment, to the sustainability of the buildings, but they also have to deal, of course, with the occupants of these buildings, so office workers, but also in dwellings. And luckily, there are some trends that there's more and more attention to the user itself and not only the building. And one of these initiatives is from the well building standard. I'm not going to promote especially this standard. It has a lot of advantages, but also very expensive. So maybe yeah, that's another discussion. Anyway, it's a good initiative, I think. And they not only look at the building, but also at the occupant, look at thermal comfort, indoor air quality, sound, etc. And I'm especially interested in the thermal physiology, so I will put some extra attention to that. In Maastricht University, where I work, we have also a large renovation project on an old caserne for military purposes. It's now a university building, and we really get experience now with the well building standard there for teaching purposes. So, but there's now a new version of the well building standard. Last year, I think it was there, and there they have a couple of new aspects or new things in there, like for instance the principles. And what is important here on principle 6 is that they really describe, they want to make use of the advantages of the scientific knowledge. So they adapt the concepts they have and to the latest news. So I think that's a good initiative. And then when I look at the thermal comfort, then I think there's maybe some improvement needed, because they intend in this well building standard to go for the maximum level of comfort. And this is something I do not agree with. And I think maybe our studies and results can be input for this kind of certification to come up to a more healthy and sustainable approach of the thermal comfort. Because is thermal comfort and health, are they the same? Well, I don't think so, not in all cases. Of course, there's some limits, but we know if you're always comfortable, you may change a little bit. And yeah, this is something I would like to go to talk a little bit more about. But let's first have a look. We changed rather a bit in our housing conditions. We started, of course, with simple housings, being exposed a lot to the outdoor environment, also went in and out much more often than we nowadays do. And gradually, we went living inside in large buildings, but also in very isolated and well-controlled houses. So we are less and less exposed to the outdoor environment. And this is quite an issue because in the indoor environment, we still apply a lot of the knowledge of fungi. And fungi itself, the model is not that bad. I mean, it's a very limited inclusion of human physiology and also a limited inclusion of the individual differences. But still, it's an interesting model and allows some variation. Nevertheless, this model has led to a kind of regulation of tightly controlled indoor temperatures. So we got very narrow ranges of indoor, and somehow this is still the case, although we know much more about that nowadays. And I'm not going to call it then the fungal model, but more the conventional model. And you see here a simple graph that the indoor environment hardly changes compared to the outdoor environment. So of course, in summertime, it's a little bit warmer indoor, and in wintertime a little bit cooler, but there's not much of a variation. Also not on the 24-hour cycle. This was really different. If you here see a graph from Great Britain, you see there's a huge change in the indoor air temperature. Of course, the bedroom was much cooler in the past than the living room, and nowadays they're both approximately the same temperature and way higher. So 15 degrees bed temperature was normal in Britain, often very cooler even. And there are studies known that also in other places that even much lower, 13 degrees was quite acceptable. So it's just a matter of what you're used to. But nowadays, all houses are in all the different rooms have approximately the same temperature. Even worse nowadays is this with the increasing heat, you see the increase of airco usage, and that is really tremendous. And if you see some of this extrapolation, then you will need so many aircos, and you create so many heat in towns that's really a vicious cycle, which we do not want, I think. But let's go back to the biology. Yeah, we really face the problem with westernized diseases, modern diseases like overweight and related to that metabolic diseases. So we call it a metabolic syndrome, and some of it is type 2 diabetes. We also have cardiovascular disease and much more related to this obesity. And that's really a big issue. So all these phenomena around this, we call the metabolic syndrome, and it's related to metabolic health. And that is, in fact, what we are studying. And of course, there are several causes of that. It is in the past, we had to work for our food, gather or hunt. And nowadays, it's relatively easy. Here you see my daughter in the United States. Of course, very happy with all the food, but we don't really need to work for it. At least she makes a little dance, makes a difference, a bit of movement, but not too much. And yes, we are living in buildings, and if we go to the building, we take the car and we get less engaged in physical activity. These are the main lifestyles, but I think the thermal environment could attribute to this as well. So we nowadays really study not only the older lifestyle factors, exercise and nutrition, still very important, but we include also temperature. So then if we look at the energy balance, of course, with food intake, we increase our energy balance and then our weight increases. And if we engage in physical activity, although we need to do a lot of activity to reduce weight, but it helps because you spend energy with activity. So I think we could add to that living outside the thermal neutral zone. And now I'm going to explain a few slides on thermal physiology, lecture. So what in fact is the thermal neutral zone? And first you need to know something more about thermoregulation. How do we regulate our temperature? First of all, behavior. That's by far the most important. We can open windows, we can go outside, inside, sit in the shade, or put on the heater. So behavior is extremely important. From a physiological point of view, we have the skin perfusion, and skin perfusion regulation is a relatively cheap way of regulating. You see this in the picture on the right side. You see if you have a lot of blood to the skin, then you lose a lot of heat. And if you have vasoconstriction in the cold, then you have less blood to the skin and you have less heat loss. So the heat loss can be changed by a factor almost 10 times differences in the heat loss from the body. So that's quite cheap, but still you have to use your heart and your vascular system. So it's still a kind of training of the body if you are engaged in warm and cold environments. In the cold, you can increase your metabolism by shivering, for instance, and in the heat, of course, you have sweating, and then you have evaporation of the water of the sweat, and with that you have heat loss. So this is the model that we work with, and that is quite important to understand our behavior, because here you see that it's a low energy usage where you only use the blood perfusion of the skin and the hands and the feet, where, as you indicate by the cartoons on the lower side. So around 30 degrees, that's what we call the thermal neutral zone. If you go cooler, then you see you start shivering and non-shivering, which is chemical heat production. I'm not going into these details. We did a lot of work on that, but it's important to know that that increases the metabolism, and the heat production costs energy. And when we are living in natural environment, we try to omit that because that costs energy and you need to hunt more. And if you go to a warmer environment, you need extra drinking water because sweating starts and evaporation takes place. So the thermal neutral zone is more or less the same as the comfort zone, and that drives our behavior. So we want to be there in this comfort zone because it's cheap. It's cheap in water and it's cheap in energy. So in the natural circumstances, we want these savings and we go to strive after that condition. But nowadays, it is not so healthy anymore to always be in that comfortable zone because we have less resilience to heat and cold. So once we get exposed, we cannot deal with it anymore, and we have less metabolic health. I will show you some examples of that. So in our westernized world, we really need to be exposed, I think. So what is about heat? Well, heat, we have to be careful, of course. If it's too warm, we may even die. So we have to really keep our body at 37 degrees Celsius. This is not so strict, as you see on the right-hand side. There's some variation depending on the condition. But in general, about 37 degrees when you're not too active. And if you then have heat stress, you come in the heat during the heat wave, then your body temperature rises, you get some cardiovascular strain, you get reduced performance, and in the end, you may even end up with heat illness or a heat stroke, like in sports sometimes occurs, which can be very dangerous and life-threatening. But we have to realize that we are very good sweaters. We are really tropical animals, so we can be engaged in warm environments. There's no problem. We have lots of sweat glands. We have a huge capacity for sweat production. And you see here some examples. And we can really increase the amount of sweat 3 times if we get exposed to heat. If we're not, we cannot. I mean, we don't have them. The body is always then taking in the spare, how do you say, they try to reduce the costs of sweat glands. But if you're exposed, you get more sweat glands and sweat glands get larger. You see this here in an example. And I might have to add here that in the textbook, nearly all the studies have been done with active heat acclimation. And that means they had the heat and exercise. So not only heat, but including exercise. And if you see some of the results, and here's quite classical example, you see during that exercise in the heat, then you see before acclimation that during that exercise, the heart rate really goes up and you cannot sustain this longer than an hour. And with the same exercise after being used to heat, you see that the heart rate doesn't go up that much and you can sustain at least for 4 hours. So there's a huge improvement in the capacity and the resilience of the body to heat. And you see that for all kinds of different parameters like the plasma volume, you see a reduced body temp, core body temperature, you see sweating rate goes up, and it all happens within a week. So we can really get adapted to it fast. We call that acclimatization. So that's good news. So we can do something about it. And if we get exposed to heat, we get a more resilient body, and also we get a healthier body. And I'll show you an example because that is one of the studies that we did in the last years. Of course, we have been working a lot on the cold, but the last years we worked on heat as well. And we see really advantages of being exposed to heat. This is then our metabolic unit in Maastricht. And here we can do all kinds of experiments. You see the technicians, investigators, happy volunteers locked up in the rooms. And there we can engage them in all kinds of experiments. And this is one of my students, Hanna Palubinsky, nowadays postdoc at our lab. She did a passive heat acclimation, and this is passive because there's no exercise involved, just conditions that you could create in buildings. Of course, it's relatively warm, 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, but because it was the first experiment we did in this way. And we did 6 hours per day, 10 days warm exposure. And before and after the acclimatization, sorry, we measured in a kind of up protocol and a ramp of temperature, the effect on certain physiological parameters. So before and after the acclimation, you were exposed to heat. And what are some of the results I show you here? First of all, you see that there's a drop in core temperature, that's the upper graph, after the acclimatization. So that's creating a kind of buffer for the heat, being exposed to the heat. So that is a good effect. We also saw a drop in blood pressure, which is healthy, it's good. And then we see, to our surprise, we also saw a lower plasma glucose, and we saw better insulin levels. So in general, the glucose metabolism was strongly improved. So that's good news. It's really healthy to be exposed regularly to the heat. So in general, there are two things. It's good for your metabolic health, and you get better resilience once you get exposed in, for instance, a heat wave. So the message is, yes, be exposed to warmer environments in summer, and don't keep the temperature at level with all kinds of ridiculous air goes. Okay, then we go to the cold. Well, I have done a lot of experiments in the cold and also in mild cold conditions, but for the sake of time, I cannot show you these results. One of the things we discovered during these studies was the brown fat, which is in animals also linked to metabolic health. And we have some nice metabolic health effects. Here you see, for instance, a subject in thermal-neutral condition and in mild cold. And in mild cold, you activate that brown adipose tissue that produces heat in the body. So it's a healthy fat. And also is related to better glucose metabolism. The last years we discovered it's not only the brown fat, it's also the muscle metabolism. And then we came up with a nice comparison that in fact, there's a lot of things in parallel with exercise. So exercise and cold have more or less comparable effects on our metabolic health. We see a better glucose metabolism. We see a better effect on our energy metabolism, in generally increasing metabolic health and decreasing body weight. Of course, the mechanisms are different, and we're still working on this a lot, to a great deal. But the general conclusion is that both heat and cold have a positive effect on our health and create a better resilience. This is a bit surprising. So then we think it may not be just a certain temperature. So then we'll come up to this 15 degrees or so, but it's more the variation that can be important. So be sometimes exposed, especially in winter, to cold because you get better health and you get more resilient, and be sometimes exposed to heat in the summer, especially, then you get better resilience in that case. So we have to change, of course, and go and really implement to the adaptive model, because that model is not new. It's in the ASHRAE direction, also European guidelines, but it's generally not really applied in our buildings. So really in summer times have higher temperatures inside and in winter times cooler, and play also with day-night variation. And that can also have a lot of energy savings in the buildings. Because you don't need to keep that control, that tight temperature. And natural ventilation is then the way to go, I think, at least. Adapt your ventilation to these needs of the users of the buildings. I would like to end with some examples. If I see I have still some time, a few minutes is correct. Huh? So I will give some examples of the last experiments we did are really related to thermal comfort. One is that we applied this drifting temperature concept in a laboratory study. It's in a larger project where we also look in actual buildings, but I show you the results of a laboratory study where we had really a dynamic temperature range from 17 degrees Celsius to 25. So it is quite a large range. And you would think, well, 17 is really too cold and 25 is really too warm. But since it's dynamic, you know, when you're at 17, you know, you feel it's getting warmer. So you may accept the lower temperatures, and the same with the higher temperatures. So dynamic is really different from a static fixed climate. Here you see the results of the temperatures. These are the letters are a bit small maybe, but you see here the mean skin temperature during a stable. We compare the normal fixed temperature with the dynamic profile. And the lower graph shows you that the skin temperature really fluctuates with the dynamic profile. We also saw that the energy expenditure was slightly higher, especially in the morning during the dynamic conditions, and that can be attributed to more activity. So people get in the cold a little bit more active. So it's good news, not a large difference, but it's there, and on the long term that can be significant. And we were happy to see that the thermal sensation, of course, goes up and down with the, as you see in the dark curve here, with the drifting temperature, but the thermal comfort in both cases was within the just comfortable range. So acceptable temperatures for this group of volunteers. So in general, we can say that the temperature ramp in general is voted as comfortable, although temperatures range from 17 to 25. So there's really a potential for the dynamic temperature, creating some resilience, good for metabolic health, and still comfortable conditions. Of course, and now I didn't show you the data from the male-female differences, but it's correct that we saw also in the questionnaires at the start. Yes, there's a lot of difference. If we look at our model, the thermal neutral zone, then in general, women are more at the warmer side, and men are more on the warmer side with the thermal neutral zone. So in general, women tend to feel cooler and want a warmer environment. So there's still, and on top of that, there's a lot of individual variation. So here we did a study on if we have this dynamic temperature, can you still add some comfort with local personal control? So only hands and feet and the head for cooling. So hand and feet for warming and the head for cooling. Here you see we had cooling fans. It was a desk from Ireland. We had a desk that can be warmed and a heating mat for the feet. Yeah, relatively simple, and people could choose and regulate. Here you see we did the experiments in the respiration chambers. And we had a ramp now just going up from 17 to 25 again. And you see on the right-hand side that indeed in the morning they use the heating mats and the desk. And in the afternoon, when it was warmer, of course, they used the fan more. And the results show that the thermal sensation was, of course, different from stable, from without control. So you see in black, you see there's no personal control, and in red, you see the personal control. And on the right-hand side, you see the thermal comfort, and you see the thermal comfort was increased using personal control. So with only hand and feet and head, you can already improve the thermal comfort. You see the skin temperatures. For sake of time, just briefly mention that the distal temperatures were indeed affected, but not the body temperature itself, which means that the health effects of the temperature variations still keep on working on the body. We saw a decrease in blood pressure, an increase in mood that was significant. So all in all, we see that the personal control is effective in increasing comfort, but there's still the positive effects of this temperature variation on our body physiology. So the overall conclusion now is that we really think that we need to be exposed outside our thermal neutral zone on a regular basis, that we still can attain comfort. You get used to these environments, you get a more comfortable condition, and still your body needs to work. So that's why we call it a kind of temperature training. And this can all be used as input for the well building or other standards, I think. Now, as last two slides, and then I'm really ready. We are working now in a new project together with a lot of companies on a renovation concepts where we want to really make this dynamic idea into practice. And but for the sake of time, I'm not going to tell much. We also work together with different faculties at the university in this new building, also for education purposes, and see how the dynamic profile works with that. So with that, I would like to end this talk, and thank you very much. I hope I was still almost in time. I was. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Wouter. There was a lot of information in a short time. I'm sure that you can talk hours about this theme, and I'm glad that we got a lot of questions. So we only have a few minutes to answer these questions. So I will suggest that we will also answer these questions by sending the answers to the people and put them on the website. Let's go to pick one out. Mick asked a question when you were talking about using different temperature zones. Isn't this the main reason why Scandinavian people have their sauna routine? Relative extreme body exposure to cold and warm environments, swimming in cold water, then switching to a hot room to improve your health. So don't we do it already? Or is this the main reason?
Yeah, there are not that many sauna studies, but the sauna indeed, there are also positive effects on our health with respect to sauna usage. I don't know whether it's really the main reason why they do it. Maybe they just like it and do it for other means, because a lot of cold and heat exposure also gives you you get a kind of mental boost also from this. So it can be different reasons why they do it, but the few studies that have been done really show a positive effect on our health, indeed.
Yeah. Thank you. And then we have a question from Christoph Dix. He says, we support the adaptive comfort model to achieve significant energy savings, but it's hard to convince customers. And he asked, could you provide, or is it possible to provide a range of temperatures for different kinds of buildings? So is there a difference for when you use the temperature in offices or in warehouses or production sites? Because people do different kind of activities in these kind of buildings. And do you also need different kind of temperature ranges?
Yes, I think you could do that. But there are two answers to that. In fact, you can do that. And for instance, also for elderly care homes, and so you need maybe different temperatures, and for vulnerable people, yes, for sure. So different buildings, different ranges, that is one thing. But the main thing is that these this kind of approach works when people are involved. So there should be some way of control. If you have more control of your temperature, you accept wider ranges. If it's all set, then let's say that we even set this dynamic profile, then in the end you may get again a problem. So you could have let's say a dynamic profile, but on top of that, people should be able to open windows, to have some personal control, to at least have some control. That's extremely important.
Okay, thank you for that. Ido Schuring asked, does the dynamic temperature range also apply function better for certain activities? So you are saying, yes, that's true, but people will always should have the possibility to control it by themselves, by opening a window or using the devices you showed us in the last part of your presentation.
Yes, I think so. And I saw that also in very well-controlled geotabs building, very interesting one. It was in Luxembourg. And I talked to the architect about it. And then we went to the toilet, and even there the windows could be opened. That was very surprising.
Okay.
So, and I said, can the system work with that? And he said, yeah, it's no problem. I mean, people don't open it when it's really stupid to open them. So they use it in a sensible way, and then the control system can handle it. So it is possible to give this control.
Okay, then we have the last question, because we don't have the time for that. That's, as I said before, we will answer these questions in the chat and it will be recorded so you can look back at the answers. Martin Wirtz, he says, a great talk, Wouter. What is your recommendation for ventilation system? So as a ventilation system versus manual ventilation. So do buildings need a general ventilation system, or is it better to use a manual ventilation where it can be more personal for the people?
Yeah, I think it should be personal, but also, yesterday I heard a talk about it, and it's also in this new BRIM project that we are going to do. Yes, there we are still going to investigate it, but I think there are many options where you have control also without, let's say, opening windows or other means. There are many different ways of having this control, and I'm not good enough in the techniques to say which ventilation system would then be the best. Maybe in the coming years with this new project, I could answer that question. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, then yeah, let's stay in touch, and if you have new information, we can share that. So